Hello guys, today we're going to be talking about radar missiles, how they work and how to dodge them. So I'm going to say straight away, understanding the basic principles of how radars work will help you dodge radar missiles, and it's going to make you a better player as well. As a disclaimer, some things might be simplified, and we're only going to be talking about radars that can actually guide a missile here, so none of that World War II stuff. Usually, also, we're only going to be talking about when the radar is locked or single target track, unless it's otherwise specified. This is because search modes and track modes often use different things to work. So, remember to like and subscribe if you enjoy the video, and let's get started. The first and most simple type of radar that you're going to encounter is just pulse. Something like this can be found on the MiG-21S, or for example the F-8 Crusader. These work by firing radar pulses and then waiting and listening for the signal to bounce back. When you fire a missile, the radar pulses bounce off of the target and are reflected in all directions. The missile's seeker head picks up these reflected pulses and uses them to guide itself onto the target. It will guide itself towards the strongest signal, which should be the enemy aircraft your radar is pointed at. Uh-oh, chaff. Wait, where did the plane go? So, chaff works because it has a gigantic radar cross-section. This completely overwhelms the receiver with radar energy. Think about how your eyes react when somebody shines a really bright light in your face. And your eyelids all close a little bit to kind of block out the light. Well, the receiver acts in a similar way, making the radar return of the plane basically invisible because it's so much smaller than the chaff's radar cross-section. This is why just one pop of chaff can completely bamboozle a missile that has pulse guidance. Okay, let's swap the planes around now, or we'll make the F-4 Phantom the attacker firing a Sparrow. The F-4 uses continuous wave, or CW, to guide its missiles. As the name suggests, continuous wave fires a constant and uninterrupted beam of radar energy at the target. This wave is then reflected back to the missile, and the missile uses this to guide it onto the target. For now, it sounds pretty similar to the first one, right? But then, chaff. But this time, the missile is still guiding onto the target. Why? The radar is forward, and the radar locks onto the chaff the same as it did before. But the missile ignores this false lock. The target aircraft is still inside the beam, and so some radar energy is reflected off the aircraft and onto the missile still. This leads to cases where the missile still guides onto the target despite the radar lock being interrupted or completely false due to chaff. But how does the missile know which target is the real target? Well, CW missiles have a pre-programmed rule set which looks at the target's Doppler shift. So then you might ask, well, what is the Doppler effect? It's super simple, so we'll just quickly go through it. Let's say we have our F-4 here, and it's just sitting on the runway. Now we switch on the engines, and the sound waves from the engine move out in a circle around us. Okay, pretty simple. Now let's take off, and we'll go to afterburner. Because we're moving quite fast, the sound waves that are ahead of us get all squished together, and the sound waves behind us get stretched out as we pull them along with us. When we're talking about sound, we hear this as high pitch and low pitch, like this example I'll play now of a car horn driving past. When it's moving towards us, the sound is Doppler shifted to have a higher pitch. When it's moving away from us, it's shifted lower. You might start putting two and two together here, and yes, the same thing happens with radar. When the radar beam bounces off of a moving target, it gets Doppler shifted. And because the chaff isn't moving, or at least it slows down very quickly, it doesn't have a Doppler shift, so the missile uses its pre-programmed rules to ignore it because it has the wrong Doppler shift. A simple rule set is one thing, but with advanced signal processing, we can put this into the radar itself. This is when you go from a basic radar to a pulse-Doppler radar. These radars are basically immune to chaff in the traditional sense. So how do we counter this? Well, if we quickly go back to that diagram again, perfectly at 90 degrees, above and below us where the red lines are, the sound waves aren't squished or stretched. They look exactly the same as a target that isn't moving at all. Because the plane is moving side to side, only the waves that are moving backwards and forwards get squished or stretched. The waves that are moving side to side don't get squished or stretched at all. So, that's the same as something that isn't actually moving at all. And these radars are programmed to ignore things that aren't moving, like the ground. That lets the radar look down without having any ground clutter. But that introduces a weakness. Targets that are moving exactly 90 degrees to the radar essentially become invisible, and you can't lock onto them because you can't see them. This is called notching, and it's the most reliable way to fool anything that uses a Doppler shift to track you. This includes those CW missiles we were talking about earlier, although you will still need to chaff the radar before you notch the missile. How easy a pulse-Doppler radar is to notch depends on how good the resolution is. For some early radars, they only might be able to tell the difference between 50 kilometers an hour or so. So even if you're still moving towards the target at 50 kilometers an hour because your angle's kind of bad and you're not perfectly at 90 degrees, the radar might still lose you because of the poor resolution. As you go higher and higher in BR and you get more and more modern aircraft, they become harder to notch and you'll need to be closer and closer to a perfect 90 degrees. It's also often worth popping chaff while you're in the notch because as your relative speed goes down, the chaff becomes more and more effective. Lastly, we'll move on to active radar homing missiles, sometimes known by their NATO codename Fox 3. In addition to the radar set in the plane, these missiles also have their own radar in the nose cone instead of a passive seeker head. So, okay, you might think, I'll just notch the missile and I'll be fine, right? Well, provided the attacking aircraft has turned away, then yes, you can just notch the missile and you'll be fine. The problem, though, is if the attacking aircraft is still keeping you locked or highlighted with track while scan. In this case, even if you notch the missile perfectly, the aircraft can use its data link to talk to the missile and tell it where to go. It's able to then use this data link information to guide itself onto target. And even without data link or a lock, it can still use inertial guidance to travel to where it thinks you should be based on where you were traveling at the time it lost its lock, and then detonate with its proximity fuse. These multiple guidance methods are what make these missiles so hard to dodge. In reality, most planes will be forced to turn away before the missile reaches you. So notching does usually work, but there are only two reliable ways to dodge these missiles. The first is just going to be to turn 180 degrees and fly away in the opposite direction, waiting for the motor to burn out so it doesn't have enough energy to chase you. This is obviously the most boring way, but it's also the most foolproof. The other method is to use multipathing, which is quite simple to explain, so I'll just pop up this diagram here. When you're flying very close to the ground, you'll have the good lock shown by the green line, but you can also have the radar beam bounce off the ground and hit the target. This gives a false radar return, and it shows the radar that the target is actually under the ground. It confuses the radar and eventually just ends up with the missile taking a nosedive into the ground. A little while back, they did make this method slightly harder. I believe it's 25 meters now, so you have to be at or below 25 meters, but it could be up to 50. I'm not sure on the exact numbers, but the closer you are to the ground, the better it works. So, if you use all of this information, you should be able to deal with the vast majority of radar missile threats that come your way. Notching can take some practice though, so don't get discouraged if you can't do it straight away. Also, flying low enough to make use of multipathing can also take some practice and be quite difficult, especially if you're dealing with uneven terrain, so there are valleys and things like that, it goes up and down, or there are trees which are actually higher than the multipath threshold, so again, it's not 100% reliable either. But with a bit of practice and a combination of these methods, you should do quite well. So thank you for watching, guys. If you enjoyed this video, why not check out the next one, linked above.